They tell me my lungs have scar tissue now. The doctors here at the veterans facility use words like chronic hypoxic damage and residual fibrosis, and they say it with the careful politeness of men who have never been above 12,000 feet and never intend to go. I nod. I thank them. I do not tell them what I know, which is that the cold up there does something to a man that no medical chart will ever adequately describe. It gets inside you. Not the temperature. I mean whatever it is that lives in the cold. Whatever learned long ago that the thin air and the killing wind were a better fence than any wall. I was 31 years old when they sent me up. I had done 2 tours of conventional frontier work by then, both in contested border zones, and my commanding officer said I had the temperament for high-altitude operations. What he meant was that I didn't panic and I didn't talk too much. Those were considered virtues in the briefing rooms. Up on the ridge line, I would come to understand they were the bare minimum requirements for surviving the first 48 hours. The expedition was not military officially. That was the first lie. The second lie was that we were going up to confirm signals intelligence, anomalous thermal readings at elevations, where nothing warm-blooded had any business being warm. The third lie, and the one that cost us the most, was that we were the first team to go up looking. We were not the first. Dr. Erickson knew that. He'd led the previous survey, the one that came back 2 men short with no explanation that held up under questioning. He was a compact, methodical man in his late 50s, the kind of scientist who fills 3 notebooks before he says a single word out loud. I respected him. He had the look of someone who had already paid for what he knew and was paying again just by being there. Connie Hayward came because of her brother. Jim Hayward had been on Erickson's first survey, and Jim had not come back with the others. He was listed as missing, not dead, because they hadn't found enough of him to close the file. Connie was not military, not science staff, not anything the operation required. She was a young woman with a set jaw and a brother who was still, as far as anyone could prove, alive somewhere above the tree line. She had pushed through 3 levels of bureaucratic obstruction to get herself attached to the team as a civilian observer, and she had done it with the kind of focused, quiet fury that I had learned to recognize as more dangerous than any amount of loud anger. I was assigned as her handler. I was also assigned to keep my mouth shut about what that meant. Hud Pearson came as her escort, a big, soft-spoken man who had known the Hayward family for years. He was not a soldier. He was not afraid of heights. He carried his own weight and he didn't complain, and those 2 qualities put him above roughly half of any expedition roster I'd ever seen. I liked Hud. That matters in this telling. The 6th member of our party was Varga. I should describe Varga carefully, because everything that happened afterward depends on understanding what I did and did not see when I looked at him. He was pale, not the pale of a man who works indoors, but the pale of something that processes light differently, as if the pigmentation had been selected out over generations of living where sunlight is thin and indirect. His eyes were pale too, a gray that went to near white in direct sun. His hands were large, the fingers slightly longer in proportion than a standard human hand, and when he gripped a climbing rope, he did so without gloves in temperatures that had the rest of us in 3 layers. He was Erickson's guide from the previous survey. He was the one who had come back. I noticed these things the way a man notices a loose step, registered, filed, not yet alarming. I had been in enough strange places to know that the body adapts to elevation and cold in ways that can look strange from the outside. I gave Varga the benefit of the doubt. It was a professional courtesy, and it was the 2nd worst mistake I made on that mountain. The first worst came later. We made base camp on the 3rd day, in the shadow of a granite overhang at roughly 14,000 feet. The air up there is not thin in the way people who have never been there imagine it. It's not absent. It's simply inadequate. Every breath does about 70% of what a breath should do, and your body knows it. And your body complains about it in a constant low murmur that after 2 days becomes simply the background texture of being alive. You learn to move slower. You learn to think a half second ahead of your actions, to compensate for the delay between deciding to do something and your muscles actually committing to it. The mountain teaches this, or it kills you. There is no other option. We found the wrecked tents on day 4. The previous survey's forward camp had been set into a natural windbreak of boulders about 300 meters above our base position. Erickson led us up to it in the early morning, while the light was flat and the shadows were still long. What we found was not the result of weather. I've seen tents destroyed by wind, by rockfall, by the slow grinding weight of snow accumulation. This was not any of those things. The fabric had been pulled apart from multiple directions simultaneously, the poles bent outward at angles that suggested something had grabbed the structure and simply opened it, the way you'd open a package. The equipment inside had been sorted through. Food stores taken. Medical supplies ignored. Everything related to communication, 2 field radios, a signaling mirror, a set of emergency flares destroyed. Not taken, destroyed. Erickson looked at the ruins for a long time without speaking. I watched his face and saw the expression of a man who is confirming what he already suspected and finding no comfort in being right. Jim Hayward's personal kit was in the ruins. His notebook was there, or what remained of it, the pages that hadn't been removed. I didn't tell Connie what I read in those remaining pages. Not then. She had enough to carry. What Jim Hayward had written, in the increasingly erratic handwriting of a man dealing with both altitude and fear, was this: they are not animals. They organize. They watch before they move. They have already been here longer than we have, and they know what we are before we know what they are. He had written that 11 days before we arrived. He had written it in the ink of a man who had stopped sleeping. Varga found us at the wrecked camp. He came up from the south face, which was the direction none of us had been watching, moving with the particular economy of motion that I would later understand was not training but biology. The Veth do not waste movement at altitude the way humans do, because they evolved up here, or something close to up here, in cold and thin air, and in the endless patience of a species that measures time in seasons rather than hours. He said he had been scouting the ridge to the north. He said he had seen tracks. He said the party that had taken Jim Hayward was still in the area. He said all of this with the flat affect of a man reporting weather conditions. No alarm, no urgency. He looked at the destroyed camp and registered it the way you'd register a tide table, information, neither good nor bad, simply useful. I watched him while he spoke. I watched his eyes when he looked at the ruins, and what I did not see there was surprise. I filed that too. Erickson wanted to push higher. His logic was expedition logic. We had come this far, the data was up there. Jim Hayward was either up there or nowhere, and turning back achieved nothing. HUD thought we should establish communication with the support team below before going higher. He was right, but we couldn't, because the radio equipment at base camp was functioning only intermittently at that altitude, and Varga, who knew the relay points from the previous survey, said the nearest working relay was another 2 hours of climbing to the north, toward where he claimed to have seen the tracks. We went north. I want to be clear about what the Veth looked like, because the reports I gave afterward kept being laundered into something more convenient, and I am tired of convenient. They were not the animals the early survey footage suggested. They were not primitive. They were large. The smallest individual I saw clearly was perhaps 7 feet in bipedal stance, and they were covered in a pale coat that in shadow read as gray and in direct light read as nearly white. Not fur exactly, something denser and more structured, like the overlap of scales that have gone soft. Their faces were flat and wide, with the forward-set eyes of a predator rather than the side-set eyes of prey, and their expressions were wrong. Not blank, wrong. The muscles moved, but they moved in patterns that did not correspond to any emotional display I had a category for, and after a while you understood that you were watching a language you did not speak, and the conversation had been going on for some time without you. They moved in groups of 3. Always 3. We would later understand this was tactical, not social. 3 is the minimum number required for their preferred method of encirclement, and they defaulted to it the way a trained soldier defaults to cover whenever he stops moving. The first one we saw clearly was watching us from a ridgeline perhaps 400 meters above base camp on the second afternoon. I saw it before anyone else did, partly because I'd been looking for it, and partly because I had stopped giving Varga the benefit of the doubt by then, and started watching the directions he wasn't watching. I told Erickson quietly. Erickson raised his field glasses. He looked for a long moment. Then he lowered the glasses and said, in the voice of a man who has just seen the number on the final bill, "Thermal adaptation is more advanced than the imaging suggested. The coat has an albedo that reads as ambient rock temperature in passive sensors. That's why we kept getting false negatives." I said, "How many do you think there are?" He said, "I think we've been inside their perimeter since day 2. He was right. We would prove that later at cost. HUD was the first one to put into words what the rest of us were thinking around the edges. We had stopped to rest in a shallow depression that offered some wind shelter, and HUD had been quiet for a long time, which was different from his normal quietness in that it had weight to it. He said, "Varga's been with them before, on the first survey. He came back. Nobody else from the first survey who went above 15,000 came back." Nobody answered him, because there was nothing useful to say. Varga was 20 meters away, sitting on a boulder, facing away from us. His posture was completely still, not the stillness of a man resting, the stillness of a man who is not concerned about being observed. That night I woke at 2 in the morning because something had changed in the sound of the wind, and when I looked out through the tent's frost-stiffened flap, I saw Varga standing 30 meters from the tent cluster in the open, and he was not alone. There was a shape beside him, a large shape. They were still, both of them, in the way that the Veth were still, not resting, but waiting, the way a predator waits when it already knows where the prey is going to move. I watched for 4 minutes. Then the shape moved away up the slope, and Varga turned and walked back toward the tents with the same flat economy of motion he always used. He lay down in his sleeping position. He did not look toward my tent. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning I told Erickson what I had seen. He listened with the focused attention of a man who already has a hypothesis and is receiving confirmation. He asked me 3 precise questions. Then he said, "I've been running the biology backward from behavioral observation, and there's something about Varga that I should have included in my initial report. I didn't include it because I thought it might be explained by severe altitude exposure. I no longer think that." He showed me the notes. I read them. Then I went outside and spent several minutes in the cold doing the arithmetic. Varga was not entirely human. I don't mean that metaphorically. Erickson's hypothesis, backed by what Jim Hayward had been writing before he disappeared, was that the Veth had been running a long program. Decades, possibly longer. Individuals with partial Veth biology, enough human appearance to pass at distance and in dim light, deployed into the surrounding populations. Not soldiers, scouts of a different kind. And whatever Varga was, specifically, he had been born into that program, and he had been functioning inside human expedition structures for at least a decade, and the previous surveys 2 missing members had not been lost to weather. The program's goal, Erickson said, with the steadiness of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis, appears to be integration. They want access to lower elevations. They want to be able to operate in warmer zones. They need human genetic material to get there, and they need humans who aren't screaming about it. I said, "Jim Hayward." He nodded once. I said, "Connie." He said, "Yes." The thing about receiving that kind of information at 14,000 feet with a man who is not entirely human sleeping 20 meters away is that there are very few tactical options, and all of them require the kind of calm that the human body is not particularly inclined toward in that moment. I am not a man who panics. I have been in situations that justified panic, and I have not panicked. But I want to be honest about what that morning felt like, because I think it's important to say that the absence of panic is not the same as the absence of fear. I was very afraid. I was afraid with the specific texture of fear that comes from understanding that the situation is more structured than you thought, that you've been inside someone else's plan for longer than you knew, and that the exit options are narrower than you'd like. I was also, underneath the fear, angry. This is the thing the Veth did not account for. They're models of human behavior, and they had models. Their observations were systematic. They had been watching human expedition parties for a long time. Their models accounted for fear. They accounted for aggression in the face of direct threat. They accounted for the territorial response and the self-preservation response and the herd protection response. What they did not account for, what I do not think they had a category for, was the specific quality of human anger that is not about self-preservation at all. Jim Hayward was up there somewhere. He might be alive. If he was alive, he was being used in a way that required us to consider certain hard facts about what alive meant under those circumstances. But he was Connie's brother, and Connie was 20 meters away sleeping, and Hud was 20 meters away sleeping, and Erickson was standing in front of me with notes that proved we were inside a trap that had been laid with geological patience. I was angry about all of it, the patience of it, the coldness of it, not the temperature but the calculation, the decades of planning, the long, careful infiltration, the absolute confidence that humans were manageable, predictable, containable. We were specimens to them. We were a resource problem to be solved. I have spent a significant portion of my life solving problems under bad conditions, and the thing I have learned is that anger, correctly applied, is not an obstacle to clear thinking. It is a fuel. You have to know the difference between anger that scatters you and anger that focuses you, and you have to be honest with yourself about which one you're running on. That morning in the cold, with Erickson's notes in my hand, I knew which one I had. I woke Hud first. I told him quickly and plainly because Hud was not a man who needed things softened. He sat in his sleeping bag and listened, and his face did the thing that faces do when something that was a theory becomes a fact, that particular tightening around the eyes. Then he said, "Connie." I said, "I know." He said, "If her brother's alive." I said, "I know that too, one thing at a time." We did not wake Connie yet. We needed 5 minutes of plan first. Varga was the immediate problem. He was awake. I was no longer certain he slept in the conventional sense, and he was the relay point between us and whatever Veth unit had been watching the camp. As long as he was operating freely, our options were constrained by the fact that he could signal our movements before we made them. We needed him contained. We needed him contained in a way that didn't trigger whatever protocol the Veth had in place for when their embedded asset stopped reporting. Erickson had a thought about that. He said, in the quiet, careful voice he used for hypotheses he wasn't proud of, the Veth operate on a longer time cycle than we do. Their tactical patience is very high. If Varga simply stops signaling for a period of hours, I don't think they'll immediately escalate. Their assumption will be that he is managing the situation. They plan in days, not minutes. I said, "How confident are you?" He said, 70%. I said, "That's not bad for up here." I went to where Varga was sitting and I sat down next to him, and I said, conversationally, "The way you talk to a man you're not afraid of. What do you think happened to Jim Hayward?" He looked at me with those pale eyes and said, "The mountains are dangerous. Men who go too high are sometimes lost." I said, I looked out at the slope. I said, "You know what I think is interesting? You're the only one who came back from the last survey. Out of 6 men who went above 15,000 feet, you're the only one who walked back down. What do you think the odds of that are?" He said nothing. I said, "I've been doing the math on it, and I keep coming up with the same answer." He looked at me with an expression that was not quite human, one of those wrong muscle group movements that I had categorized and filed. I was watching for it. It told me something. It told me that he was recalculating, which meant he had been caught earlier than he'd planned for, and that the recalculation was going in a direction I needed to interrupt. I hit him with the rock I had been holding in my right hand since I sat down. I want to be clear that this was not an impulsive act. I had been holding the rock since before I sat down. I had selected it from the debris field beside the tent cluster with the specific intention of ending the conversation before it reached the point where he communicated our status upward. A blow to the back of the skull, placed correctly, produces unconsciousness reliably. I had placed it correctly. He went down. Hud was beside me in 4 seconds. We used climbing rope. We used it well. Then I went and woke Connie, and I told her the truth about her brother. She took it the way she had taken everything up there, with the specific economy of a person who has been moving forward on pure will for long enough that grief has to get in line behind logistics. She asked 2 precise questions. She did not cry. She said, "Where?" I said I didn't know exactly, but I knew the direction. We went. The route above 15,000 feet is not the kind of terrain that rewards hurrying. Every step on loose scree has to be placed deliberately, weight transferred slowly, the next hold identified before the current one is released. The body's error rate goes up with altitude. The hypoxia affects fine motor first, then balance, then judgment if you push long enough, and the wind above the call was steady and hard out of the northwest, the kind of wind that pushes you sideways a half step if you're not braced for it. We moved in single file, Erickson first because he'd been this high before, then Connie, then Hud, then me at the back where I could watch. I watched. They came from 3 directions, which was what I had expected. The group of 3, always 3, appeared at the ridgeline above us, and simultaneously I saw movement at the boulder field to our left, and heard the shift in the wind that meant displacement, a large body moving through the air upwind of our position to the right. They had identified our movement and repositioned. They were fast. Not running fast, but repositioning fast. The kind of speed that comes from knowing the terrain so completely that you don't have to think about footing. Erickson stopped. He turned around and looked at me and said, with the voice of a man completing a long chain of logic, "They don't know we've contained Varga. They're repositioning based on our movement pattern, not on an alert." I said, "How does that help us?" He said, "They're moving to intercept, not to enclose. There's a difference. Enclosure means they've committed. Intercept means they're still deciding." I said, "What makes them decide?" He said, "If we keep moving toward the position where Jim was taken, they'll decide we've independently discovered too much and escalate to containment." I said, "And if we stop?" He said, "They'll wait. They're very good at waiting." Hud said from behind me quietly, "I don't want to wait." I looked at the 3 shapes on the ridgeline above us. They were still. The gray-white coat made them difficult to see against the granite and snow. You had to look for the outline, the shape that was slightly wrong in the texture of the slope. At 400 meters in good light I could identify them. At 200 meters I would have been looking at teeth. I had 3 signal flares. I want to explain my thinking because it has been questioned in the reports I have given since, and the questioning has always come from people sitting at sea level. The Veth were highly cold adapted. They operated in an environment defined by the absence of fire. In terms of raw evolutionary history, the one thing that high-altitude cold-adapted biology is genuinely, reflexively, non-cognitively afraid of is sudden intense heat. Not heat that builds, sudden heat. The way you are afraid of a loud noise in the dark, not a decision, a response, something that happens before the thinking begins. A signal flare burns at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. It burns for 60 seconds. It produces light and heat and smoke in quantities that are, at 14,000 feet in the Himalayan winter, essentially unprecedented in the sensory experience of any organism that lives up here. I fired the first one directly at the group on the ridgeline. Not at them, past them close. Close enough that the heat bloom would hit them. The response was immediate, and it was not a tactical repositioning. It was a flinch. A full-body, non-cognitive, pre-rational flinch, all three of them backward and down, the way a man who touches a hot stove pulls his hand back before the nerve signal has completed its journey to the decision-making parts of his brain. They flinched, and in flinching they went from controlled high ground to scrambling, and scrambling meant they were off balance, and off balance meant the geometry of their encirclement had collapsed. I fired the second flare at the boulder field to the left. Same result. The shapes there went in two directions, neither of which was toward us. Erickson was already moving. He had grabbed Connie's arm, and he was pulling her upslope in the gap that had opened in the right flank, and Hud was right behind them, and I was running last with the third flare in my hand, running at 14,000 feet in the Himalayan wind, which is not running in any sense the word usually implies. It is a controlled, desperate lurch forward, each breath doing 70% of what it should, the body screaming and the mind overruling it. Because this is the thing about humans that the Veth had not modeled. We don't stop when we should stop. We don't stop when stopping would be the biologically rational choice. We don't stop when the math says the oxygen isn't there, when the muscles are failing, when the odds are wrong. Something in us, I don't know what to call it, stubbornness is too small a word, spite is closer but still not right. Something in us decides that the situation is unacceptable and keeps moving anyway. We found Jim Hayward in a natural cavity in the rock face, approximately 200 meters above where we had been standing when I fired the first flare. He was alive. He was not well, the altitude, the exposure, whatever the Veth had done to understand his physiology. He was not well at all. But he was breathing and he was conscious, and when Connie went to him he recognized her and said her name. There is no adequate description of what that moment cost and returned simultaneously. I will not try. What I will say is that we had perhaps 4 minutes. Erickson knew it. I knew it. The flares had created a gap, not an escape. The Veth were repositioning on a different geometry now, the 3-unit tactic abandoned in favor of something that looked, from the movement I could track on the ridgelands above us, like a broad encirclement designed to cut off descent. They were not panicking. That was important to understand. The flares had disrupted them, not defeated them. They were adapting. They were doing it methodically, without the kind of frantic urgency that would have produced errors. They were adapting the way a cold system adapts, steadily, inevitably, moving toward a new equilibrium that did not include us getting off the mountain. I had 1 flare left. Erickson said, "The relay point is 200 meters to the east-northeast. If we reach it and I can get a signal through, we have support within 40 minutes. 40 minutes was longer than 4, but it was not infinite. I said, "How do we get to the relay point?" He said, "Through them." Hud said, "Give me the flare." I looked at him. He said, "I'm not a climber, I'm not a scientist, I'm not military, I'm a big man who can run in a direction and make a lot of noise." He looked at Connie, who was supporting Jim's weight between her shoulder and the rock face. He looked at me. He said, "I'm also the person here with the least useful job." I said, "Hud." He said, "Don't make it complicated. Give me the flare and tell me which direction buys you the most time." I gave him the flare, and I told him the direction. He went. I am not going to elaborate on what happened to Hud Pearson. I am going to say that he was exactly what he said he was, a big man who could run in a direction and make a lot of noise, and that he used the last flare at the right moment in the right direction, and that the gap he created was real, and that we used it. I am going to say that we searched for him afterward, when the support team arrived, and we had numbers enough to be on that slope without dying. I am going to say that we found enough to close the file. I am going to say that Hud Pearson bought us 40 minutes and change, and that he did it without hesitation, and that I have not met many people in my life of whom I could say that. The relay station was a metal box the size of a suitcase, bolted to a rock face at the end of a cable that ran down into the mountain's interior, part of the survey infrastructure from the previous expedition. Erickson reached it and opened it with hands that were shaking from cold and exertion, and something else that neither of us acknowledged. He got the signal out in under 2 minutes. I spent those 2 minutes watching the slope and counting shapes. There were more than 3. There were more than 6. The encirclement they were building was not the 3-unit tactic. It was larger, a full sweep, the kind of movement you commit to when you have decided that containment is the only acceptable outcome. They had made a decision. The flares, the disruption of their pattern, the loss of Varga's function as an internal relay point. They had processed all of it and concluded that the exposure risk outweighed the patient's advantage, and they were moving to end it. I'm not ashamed to say that the 40 minutes we waited were the longest 40 minutes of my life. We were in a cleft of rock that offered some shelter and a defensible position in the limited sense that only one approach gave them a clear line at us. And I had a climbing axe, and Erickson had a geological hammer, and Connie had a knife that she had produced from somewhere in her kit, without anyone asking her to. Jim was conscious enough to understand the situation, and he said, very quietly, that he was sorry he hadn't gotten out a warning when he still could, and Connie told him to shut up and stay low, and he did. They came at us 3 times in those 40 minutes. 3 probing moves, testing the approach geometry, looking for a way in that didn't require them to come at us directly through the one approach we could cover. The first 2 were not close enough to be critical. The third one was very close, and it was at the point of the third probe that I understood something about the Veth that the briefings had missed entirely. They do not like to die. This sounds obvious. Nothing that is alive likes to die. But the Veth relationship to individual death was not the relationship of soldiers who accept loss as a cost of operation. It was something more complex and more careful than that. When I moved aggressively toward the third probe, with the axe and with volume just sheer noise, the kind of wordless roar that a man produces when he has run out of other options, the probe pulled back. Not far, but back. They recalculated. They chose the geometry again, over the direct approach. It cost them time. It was 11 minutes of time, which was the difference. The support team came from below the call, which was not the direction I expected. They had apparently gotten a warning from the relay signal and come up the eastern route rather than the standard approach, which was tactically sound, and which put them in a position the Veth had not covered. There were 6 of them, armed with equipment that I will describe only as considerably more persuasive than a geological hammer, and when they arrived on the slope above the Veth's southern flank, the encirclement became a very different problem for the Veth than it had been 30 seconds before. The disengagement was fast, faster than I would have expected. The shapes on the ridgeline simply ceased to be visible, one by one, withdrawing up into the higher terrain where the support team's equipment had limited effect and where pursuit was not survivable for humans. They were gone inside of 3 minutes, and then there was only the wind and the slope and 6 men from the support team and the 4 of us in the cleft of rock, and Jim Hayward breathing carefully, and the place in my chest where the last 40 minutes had done their work. The debrief took 3 weeks. Not because the facts were complicated, but because the implications took time to process through the people who had to process them. The Veth, they got a more official name in the classified reports, but I used the name I gave them, because it's mine. The Veth had been operating in the high Himalayan zone for longer than the survey program had existed. Varga was not unique. His type, the partial biology infiltrators, had been placed across multiple contact points, not just the survey expeditions. How many, and how far down into the lowland populations any of them had gotten, was a question the debriefs were still working on when I was released from the process. Jim Hayward recovered. Not fully. There are things that altitude and exposure do to a body that full recovery is too strong a word for, but he was functional and he was himself, and he sat across from me in a hospital corridor 6 months later, and told me that the Veth had not been cruel to him in any way that was not instrumental. They had wanted information. They had been patient in getting it. He said the hardest part was that they were clearly intelligent, clearly organized, clearly capable of something that he could only call planning in the long sense, not days or seasons but generations. Decades. He said they thought they had us figured out. I said they had a lot of it right. He said not the part that matters. I said no, not that part. The part they got wrong was the part they couldn't have studied from observation, because it is not a behavior. It is a quality underneath behavior. You can watch humans for 100 years and see the fear responses and the aggression responses and the self-preservation calculus and the herd dynamics, and you will not see it directly, because it only shows up in the places where all of those things have already failed. It shows up when Hud Pearson asks for the last flare and doesn't look back. It shows up when Connie Hayward does not cry in a ruined camp at 14,000 feet, because there is still a job to do. It shows up when a doctor in a hospital corridor says his recovery is incomplete, and he is obviously right and obviously satisfied to be alive. The Veth measured what we do. They did not measure what we are when we decide that what we do isn't enough anymore. I've been in this facility for 4 months now. The lungs. They tell me I'll be here another 2, and then some restrictions on elevation, which is fine by me. I have done my elevation work. I lie here in the bed in the evenings and I watch the light change on the ceiling, and I think about the mountain, about the particular color of the sky at 14,000 feet when the wind clears the cloud cover, and the stars come out thick and cold and impossibly close. There is nothing beautiful about that altitude in any conventional sense. The body is failing. The cold is absolute. Everything is trying to kill you in one way or another. And yet there is something up there that I do not have a word for, a clarity, maybe, or just the understanding that comes from knowing exactly what you are and what you are willing to do. I think about Hud. I think about Erickson, who died of a cardiac event 8 months after we came down at his desk in the middle of writing up the survey findings. I think about Jim, who walks with a cane now and teaches survey methodology at a university and apparently is very good at it. I think about Connie, who I have not seen since the debrief, and who I expect has gotten on with her life with the same focused, quiet fury she brought to everything else. I think about Varga, who we left on the mountain in climbing rope, and what the Veth did with that information when they found him. I do not think they were afraid. I think they were surprised. That is enough. That is, in the long arithmetic of what they planned and what they found instead, exactly enough. The cold gets inside you. I said that at the beginning, and I mean it, and I want to be precise about what I mean. It is not the mountain that stays. It is not the fear, though the fear stays too. What stays is the knowledge of what you did with the fear. What you did, and what the people beside you did, and the specific texture of those actions in the moments when the alternatives were all worse. They built a model of us. They were patient and intelligent, and they built a careful model, and they sent it up a mountain, and it failed. The mountain doesn't care about models. Neither do we when it comes to that. I think that's what they found out. There is a particular sound the wind makes at high altitude when it crosses bare granite without any vegetation to break it. A clean, toneless note that is not quite a whistle and not quite a roar, somewhere between the two, constant and indifferent. I heard it in my sleep for months after we came down. I still hear it sometimes in the early hours when the facility is quiet and the night staff are doing their rounds and the building settles in the dark. My mind goes back up there without my permission. It finds the ridge line and the flat light of early morning and the shape of 3 pale figures standing still against the sky. They were patient. I keep coming back to that, because it is the quality of theirs that I respected most and feared most and ultimately found the most useful, which is not the order you'd expect. Their patience was geological, not the patience of a man waiting for something to happen, but the patience of a process that does not distinguish between this decade and the next. They had been working their program for so long that individual expeditions were just data points in a much larger collection. We were one survey season among many. We were the survey season that went wrong, from their perspective. I wonder sometimes if they revised their models. I wonder if there is some equivalent of a debrief room somewhere above the call, where pale, wide-faced figures sit with their equivalent of notes and work through what happened and why the specimen behavior departed from the predicted range. I think they probably did. I think they are systematic enough that they would have required it. And I think this is the part I find satisfying, which perhaps says something unflattering about me. I think they would have identified the flaw in their model, and the flaw would have been: they modeled the behaviors but not the reasons for the behaviors. They modeled fear and aggression and self-preservation and herd protection. They did not model the thing that decides, in the moment when all of those models say stop, to keep going anyway. You cannot model that from observation. You can only model behaviors, and the behavior of continuing when the math says to stop looks like irrationality if you don't know what's underneath it. It looks like error. It looks like a flaw in the specimen rather than a feature. They probably wrote it up as a risk factor, unexpected non-rational persistence in extreme conditions, and fed it into the next iteration of the model, and they were probably right to do so, because it is a risk factor. From their perspective, it was a catastrophic failure mode. From ours, it was just Tuesday. I think about what Erickson said in the shelter of the relay station while we were waiting and the shapes were moving on the ridgeline. He said quietly, more to himself than to me, the way a scientist talks when he's working something out, he said, "Their fundamental error is confusing patience for advantage. Patience is only an advantage if the other party is also patient. We're not patient. We're just slow to start." I didn't fully understand him at the time. I had other things to focus on. I understand him now. The Veth took the long view. They always took the long view. They had decades of experience telling them that taking the long view was how you survived at altitude, how you outlasted the seasons, how you accumulated the kind of advantage that compounds over generations. The long view had served them for so long that it had become the only view they had. And then 6 humans, 4 of them barely qualified to be above 10,000 feet. 6 humans spent 4 days on their mountain and somehow converted the long view into a liability. Not through superior planning, not through superior equipment or numbers or preparation, through the simple, infuriating, biologically unreasonable refusal to accept that the situation was settled. Jim said it in the hospital corridor. They thought they had us figured out. He was right. And the specific place they didn't have us figured out was the place that matters most, the place that sits underneath all the fear and all the calculation and all the rational behavior, the place that says, not yet, not done yet. One more thing, one more move, one more try, because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is not acceptable, and that's not a decision exactly. It's more like a direction, built in, fixed below the level where the modeling happens. They found that out. I hope the revision to their model is thorough. I hope it accounts for what they found on that mountain, accounts for it all the way down to the mechanism, not just the behavior. Because if their next survey comes lower, and I have been told, in the careful language of people who do not want to alarm a patient with damaged lungs, that there is evidence the program extends further down the altitude gradient than the Himalayan survey had suggested. If they come lower, they are going to find the same quality in more people, with more options, in terrain that doesn't limit the response to 3 flares and a geological hammer. I think about that a fair amount. I think about it with the clarity that comes from having already been inside the situation and come out the other side, which is a different kind of thinking than the kind you do before. Before, you think about tactics and probabilities and resource allocation. After, you think about what it actually is, the thing you're doing and the thing you're up against and the actual shape of the question. The actual shape of the question is simple, which is not the same as easy. They are patient and cold, and they plan in decades, and they do not make unnecessary movements, and they are adapted to environments that are not survivable for us. And we are loud and grieving and stubborn, and we run at things with rocks in our hands when we are out of better options. And somehow, on the available evidence, That particular combination of their qualities and ours comes out in a way that the long view would not have predicted. I find that worth knowing. I find it worth carrying around. It is not comfortable, exactly. Comfort is not what you're looking for after 14,000 feet and what we lost up there, but it is solid. It is the kind of thing you can put weight on. The light on the ceiling changes in the evenings, going from the flat white of afternoon to the amber of the setting sun coming through the window at the end of the ward. I watch that change and I think of the specific color of the sky above the call, that deep winter blue that is different from any blue at lower altitude, so saturated it looks almost artificial, like a painting of sky rather than actual sky. I think of HUD's voice saying, "Don't make it complicated." I think of Connie's face when she saw her brother alive. The Veth will revise their models. They are systematic. They will account for what they found on that mountain, and they will build better models, and they will plan longer, and they will come lower, and they will find us again, different people in a different place, but the same underneath. They are going to find that the revision didn't help. Not because we're better than them at the things they're good at. We're not. We're worse at patience, worse at cold, worse at waiting, worse at the long view and the careful plan and the kind of restraint that takes decades as a matter of course. We are worse at all of it. We're just better at the thing they can't figure out how to model. I heard the night nurse in the corridor outside doing her rounds, the ward settling, the indifferent hum of medical equipment. Somewhere down the hall, a window open onto the cold night air, and through it not quite a whistle, not quite a roar. The wind. My mind went up. It found the ridge, found the light. I led it. 6 months before the expedition, I was stationed at a forward outpost on the eastern plateau, the kind of posting that does not appear in any public record, and that I mention only because it is relevant to understanding why I was selected. The work there was observation. Passive monitoring of an area designated as low-priority anomalous activity zone, which in the language of the people who write those designations means, we know something is wrong here, and we do not know what, and we are not yet willing to commit resources to finding out. I spent 8 months watching a sector of terrain where the thermal imaging produced readings that should not have been possible, given the absence of any known warm-blooded species at that altitude. I filed reports. The reports went into the system. The system produced no response that I ever saw. I mention this because when Erickson showed me his notes on the Veth physiology, the thermal adaptation, the albedo of the coat, the biology that produced a warm-blooded organism with a thermal profile that read as ambient rock temperature in passive sensors, I understood immediately why the monitoring program had produced nothing useful. We had built the monitoring system around the assumption that biology follows expected thermal signatures. The Veth had evolved around the problem. They had been invisible to our instruments, not because our instruments were bad, but because our instruments were designed to find the things we already knew existed. This is a different kind of failure than equipment failure. Equipment failure you fix by replacing equipment. The failure of looking for what you expect to find is harder to repair because it requires you to look for what you do not expect, which is impossible to do systematically. You cannot build a detection system for things you have no model of. You can only build detection systems for your models, and if your models are wrong, the detection systems are wrong in the same ways. The Veth understood this. Not abstractly, they do not appear to operate abstractly, but in the concrete sense that over the long history of their contact with human observation, the individuals who were most difficult to detect had survived longer and contributed more to the next iteration, and the next iteration was consequently better at not being detected. Evolution as counter-surveillance, running on a time scale that made our entire monitoring program look like an afternoon's work. I thought about this in the shelter at the relay station while we were waiting and Erickson worked the radio and Jim breathed steadily against the rock face. I thought, we have been inside their detection avoidance for the entire duration of the program. Everything we built to find them, they have been adapting around for longer than the program existed. And yet here we were, 4 people who stumbled into the middle of it, because one of them refused to accept that her brother was gone. And in stumbling, we had produced more usable intelligence than 8 months of dedicated monitoring. There is a lesson in that which the people who write the reports probably will not include, because it is uncomfortable. The lesson is that sometimes the most effective intelligence gathering is not the systematic program but the single person who will not stop asking where the missing person went. You cannot systematize that quality. You can only not get in its way. Connie Hayward was the most important person on that mountain. She was not trained, not equipped, not assigned to any operational role the program recognized. She was a woman looking for her brother, and looking for her brother had gotten us further into the Veth's operation than anything the survey program had intentionally set out to do. The intelligence we came back with, the biology, the hybrid program, the embedded infiltrators, Varga's existence and his type, none of it would have been in any report if Connie had accepted the answer she was given before she pushed through 3 levels of institutional obstruction to get herself up that mountain. I told Jim this in the hospital corridor. He was not surprised. He said that Connie had always been the most effective person in any situation she entered, and the reason was that she was genuinely uninterested in what the situation thought was possible. I said that sounded like the kind of thing a brother says about a sister. He said yes, and also it was accurate, and I should not underestimate how rare it is to be genuinely uninterested in the consensus about what the situation allows. He was right. It is rare. And it is, I have come to believe, the thing the Veth cannot model, not the irrationality, not the persistence, the source of both. The fact that some fraction of humans are simply not participating in the consensus about what the situation permits. They have decided below the level where the modeling happens that the situation's opinion of itself is not binding on them personally. The Veth had modeled human behavior with considerable thoroughness. They had modeled fear, aggression, self-preservation, group dynamics, hierarchy, the specific ways humans respond to cold and exhaustion and diminishing options. A thorough, evidentially based model, built on decades of observation. And it was wrong at the foundation because it modeled humans as a species that responds to situations, and some of us are not responding to the situation. Some of us are having a different conversation with something below the situation. And the situation is just the noise we have to move through to get to the part that matters. You cannot model that from the outside. You can only observe it from the inside. When the specimen starts doing things the model says it should not do and keeps doing them, and the model keeps being wrong. Erickson knew this. That is what I believe now, looking back at the way he spoke and processed and concluded. He had spent his career in the systematic study of things that defied systematic explanation, and he had made a working peace with the limits of the systematic approach. He was not surprised by the Veth. He was confirmed. He had expected that whatever was producing the anomalous readings would turn out to be operating on a logic the program had not anticipated, because that is what the interesting things always are. The interesting things are always operating on a logic the program has not anticipated. He died at his desk writing it up. I hope the writing said what he meant. I think it probably did. He was precise. The facility is quiet at this hour. The ward settling, the equipment humming, the night staff moving in the corridor with the soft efficiency of people doing their jobs in the dark. I have been here 4 months, and I know the sounds of this place the way you learn the sounds of any place you inhabit long enough. The particular creak of the floor at the nurse's station. The change in the ventilation system when the heating cycle shifts. The distant sound of traffic from beyond the window, telling me the city is still going about its business, unaware, as cities do. The mountain is still there. The Veth are still there. Whatever program they are running has not stopped because one survey season went wrong. Programs that think in decades do not stop for individual setbacks. That is the nature of programs that think in decades. They are adapting and revising and sending the next iteration down the altitude gradient, and the people who need to know this are working on it in rooms I will never see. I have given them everything I have to give. 3 weeks of debrief, Ericsson's analysis, Jim's observations, my own reconstruction of the timeline from arrival to extraction. Everything except the thing that does not go into reports. I can give them the facts of what happened. I cannot give them why it came out the way it did, because the why is not a fact. The why is Hud Pearson asking for the last flare without looking back. The why is Connie's face when she saw her brother alive. The why is the 4 minutes I sat in the shelter watching the ridgeline while the radio crackled and the shapes moved on the slopes above us, knowing the fear was there, and knowing it was not going to be the thing that decided it. The Veth have our facts now. The model is richer. The next iteration will be more sophisticated. It will still be wrong at the foundation. That has to be enough. In the long arithmetic of it, in the decades and the iterations and the slow, patient gradient of whatever they are planning, that has to be enough. I believe it is. The light goes amber on the ceiling. The wind comes through the window at the end of the ward, and I let my eyes close, and the mountain is there, cold and clear, and the sky above the call is that deep winter blue, and somewhere in the memory there is Hud's voice, easy and entirely certain. Don't make it complicated. I don't.